So welcome to today's panel. The title, if you're not sure what room you're in, is reliability a luxury good? My name's Emil. I'm going to be moderating this panel, making sure there's no fistfights on stage. Quick background on myself. I've been at SREcon for a bunch of years. I help organize. Currently, I've been working at a kick of sort of finance companies. My views are my own, though. Yeah. Now, how would you introduce yourself?
I am the CEO and founder of a teeny tiny company in the SRE/ML space called Stanza Systems. Prior to that, I was at a combination of Amazon, Google, and Microsoft for about 18 years, which is why I have no hair. And I am probably best known to most of you as the instigator of various books that attract a lot of comment.
Yeah, I'm Andrew. I've kind of got one foot in technology, one foot in regulation. So the last couple of years, I've been working in a startup on climate change. Before that, for Monzo Bank, for Facebook, for Amazon, going way back to being a software engineer in the first .com boom in 1999, 2000. And then on the regulatory side, I hear cases for a couple of the UK regulators where there's perhaps been a breach of the rules, and we decide whether or not there has been a breach of the rules and who's going to get fined how much money.
Nice. I'm Avleen. I think I've been around as long as you have, Andrew. I'm currently at Twilio. I'm the architect for site reliability there. Before that, Facebook. Before that, Etsy. Before that, Google. Before that, a bunch of other stuff. I've been coming to SREcon since I think the first one. So it's and like Lisa before that, and a bunch of other conferences and things. Joan?
Hi folks, I am Joan O'Callaghan. I work at Udemy. I am currently running a monitoring and observability team there and running all of the incidents and analysis. I've been in SRE or incident management or something like that for about 20 years now. So I still have my hair, Niall. Yeah. But yeah, that's me.
Cool. So one thing to call out is I have an eye on the Slack channel, so if you have any questions throughout the panel, feel free to drop them in there, and we'll sort of try to get to them. So a bit of the background of what this panel is about. Show of hands, who was here at last year's SREcon EMEA and saw Niall's talk on the value of reliability? Okay, a few hands. So towards the end of Niall's talk, and I highly recommend you go watch it after this session, because if you're here, you're going to find that talk interesting. Niall sort of proposed this question: is reliability a luxury good? So this is sort of the follow-on, everything springing out of that question. But Niall, maybe can you give us some context on why you proposed that question?
Yeah, sure. So the talk is called The Value of Reliability, if I remember correctly, and it's basically about a bunch of ways that we could calculate and defend the value of reliability, or explain it, represent it really. The talk itself contains a bunch of unanswered questions because that's mostly what interests me these days, apparently. Anyway, putting that to one side, it seemed to me at the time of writing the talk that, broadly speaking, reliability is in retreat across a bunch of fronts. And whether it's climate or transport systems or sewerage systems or whatever, there just seemed to be a lot less funding of keeping things going. And I found myself thinking that perhaps reliability as a concept, keeping things going as an idea, as a profession, et cetera, perhaps reliability was becoming a bit of a luxury good. Not in the sense of some glittering piece of jewelry that we might aspire to, or anything on the demand side like that, but more that reliability is kind of becoming unaffordable. And the more I thought about that framing of what reliability is and what the current structure of how people run businesses, organizations, et cetera, what they deem is affordable, what actually generates revenue, all of those questions kind of mixed up in my mind together and gave rise to that statement. So that's where it came from.
Okay. And sort of like on that, like becoming unaffordable, how will technology companies think about reliability teams and reliability in a post-zero interest rate world? Avleen, I know you wrote about this.
I wrote about this, yeah, I think a couple of months ago. And I think I was seeing a lot of the same trends that Niall was seeing where, companies did a number of things that I found surprising, but in hindsight, maybe not so much. I think everyone here must have experienced, one or more rounds of layoffs at companies over the last couple of years, either yourselves or people in your company. There was, it felt indiscriminate, right, to a lot of us. Like, it just like wide swaths of people just being cut, including the people who would have been well known as, hey, they're keeping things going. Even down to the point of they're just like keeping the lights on and like doing sustaining work. A lot of those people were also cut. At the time, I thought it was very surprising. Like, why would you cut these people when you don't have, you need this in order to keep your business going through a tough economic cycle. You're going to like sacrifice reliability. Over time, I think I've come to realize companies had actually no idea what they were doing, right? This wasn't like, shock horror, right? Like, this wasn't an intentional, we'll get rid of those people.
Niall wrote about it in his book. How could they not know what's going on if Niall wrote about it?
I should have written about it 2 years ago. Everything would have been fine. It's my fault. But no, having talked to a bunch of business leaders, people were just saying, we're just going to make cuts and just deal with it, right? And now we've ended up in a situation where, I think all of us do see on a regular basis, things are less reliable than they used to be. We feel it, right? In the services that we use, in the services we maintain in the companies we all work, it's just become worse than it was. And it's because companies just decided, look, it might work out, it might not work out, but we're in a terrible situation and we're just going to do what we're going to do. Other than like a few small places, I've yet to see that trend changing. Yeah.
Andrew?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I think there's certainly an element of sometimes people don't know what they're doing, but also I think the incentives for sometimes for tech leadership are to take those black swan risks. If there's a low probability of a serious incident occurring, then it probably won't occur during their tenure in the job, and they'll be able to say, look at the savings I've made. So I think it can be short-termism. Yeah. So actually I think it's kind of logical, and we can talk a bit later about regulation and changing the incentive structures. Yeah. But at the moment, there are consequences individually for execs in the finance industry. The responsible exec on the tech side can technically be imprisoned. I'm not sure it's ever really happened. Outside of finance, not so much.
Joan or Niall?
So, the way you were saying they didn't know what they were doing. That's true on one side, but there's also the other part of they didn't know what that reliability team did.
Yeah.
So they didn't know what they were doing. I fire you. But also, I have no idea what this person does. Something in infrastructure, something kind of like plumbing, rip it out. But I think, I kind of disagree with a bunch of the points on the basis of a lot of you have come from the very large companies. I have usually worked at the smaller companies, and I think we're forgetting what was the original trigger for the whole reliability movement. Let's hire all these people, let's find these wonderful magical unicorns, and hopefully offer them lots of money. And everything was on fire, everything was terrible, we had no consistency. We were just about getting to, config management would be nice. That's when all of this started. And I think part of the trend of having to justify reliability, having to justify the spend on this is because people who are making those decisions, they've kind of forgotten the original problem. And so we kind of got too good at it. Because I know that initially when I started at a company and I got in there at the very startup phase. Everything was on fire. It was chaos all over the place. And the SRE team very quickly became well known by everyone outside of engineering because we were consistently saving the day. And then the company grew up. We got a lot more stable, so much more resilient. And now if you say to a lot of, like, if you said to the head of sales, do you know what that team does? They'd be like, I know, like, they're good fun, but I don't actually know what they do. They don't know that they're critical. Whereas, like, say, a company like Udemy, we used to fall over when traffic got to a certain point, and one of our main sources of income was seasonal sales. And so everybody knew who the SRE team was then. Now, everything's a lot more solid, way more mature. We have different and exciting problems. Thank you, Kubernetes and Argo CD, and every automation point that has been raised by many talks here. So we have different, much more complex problems, but they are more towards maintaining reliability and maintaining resilience. So I think the further you have moved away from chaos and fire and heartache, the harder it is for people to know what you are. So I think in the smaller companies, I don't think it's that difficult to battle. It's a smaller company that is still also more towards the chaosy side. But yeah.
Do you think we should leave things and let them break more often?
Yep,
Okay.
100%.
I'm on board. Yeah.
Cover your ass, sort of say, hey, my team has been working on this, we've been patching it, we've had to work late hours, we've requested extra resources, we're not getting it. And people are like, well, what's the risk? What's the percentage? Or what's the statistic of this actually happening? And go, do you accept this risk? And then go, I'm going on holidays, you know? And they've forgotten what we do, I think is a lot of it.
I also have some visibility of other industries outside of tech. So I think I completely agree with you for, say, SaaS services and tech companies, which is probably most of the people in this room. I've got some visibility of how things look for companies running infrastructure, and they might have industrial equipment from the 1960s, which perhaps uses a mini computer. They've maybe got a fleet of Windows desktops, and they aren't even at the, maybe it will be a good thing if we stored our config, and they're at the, like, have we got backups, do they work stage. So I think the future
Which are two
is...
different stages, I would like to point out.
Yeah. I think the future is very,
stages, yeah.
very unevenly distributed across industries. So I think what we in tech, and I think most people in the room are probably from tech, see as being normal is actually very much at the mature end of the spectrum compared to a lot of other industries where software has not yet eaten the world.
Yeah, I think there's loads of things to respond to there. I think we could legitimately say that a bunch of technology, processes, et cetera, has improved over the years and the world isn't the same as it was in 2003 or 4, whatever. That seems totally fine. It also seems true that the problems move up a level in some way. Like, I think the resilience engineering folks use a term sharp end, blunt end, meaning the folks who are in the sharp end deal with the reality day to day. There's often some discontinuity between how people think the system works and how the system actually works. And sharp end practitioners are usually not in want of work to do, I think is probably the way to put it. But blunt end folks who are removed from those details and who perhaps only come across the realities when they intrude violently into their possibility space might make decisions as a result of that. So that all seems fine. But I would like to come back to the point that perhaps, I know I keep harping on about this, but the question of the representation of the value of reliability is key here, right? Because in a certain sense, what we're talking about is we believe we are doing good stuff. Like, okay, there's an asterisk there, and we can talk in great detail about what it means there. Right, but we believe we're doing good stuff. Is the problem that the organization does not understand that? In which case, it's a corporate governance question or whatever. I mean, not quite, but is the problem communication and representation of that? Or is there something more fundamental going on? And I do think there's something more fundamental going on, but it strikes me maybe as being slightly more sociological, or all of a sudden a bunch of people woke up and discovered they could take the short-term shitty decision, make a lot more money. Oh yeah, how about if we all just did that simultaneously? Like, that would be awesome.
I was going to say very quickly, speaking of short-term shitty decisions, one of the most upvoted questions right now in Slack is, what can we learn from Twitter, where it seems to me they've hugely reduced the reliability of the platform. I don't have an opinion on what they did, presumably due to layoffs, but haven't necessarily seen severe consequences as a result.
I'm sorry, say the last bit again.
So what can we learn from Twitter? They've hugely reduced the reliability of the platform, presumably due to layoffs, but haven't necessarily seen severe consequences as a result.
So I don't think it's that they haven't seen severe consequences, right? Like, I think they have seen severe consequences. They don't have moderation on the platform anymore. They have executives that get jailed in countries. They have, the service gets shut down in countries. They have severe consequences. We may not see them day to day in Ireland or in the US or in parts of Europe. They do have very severe consequences. That's just on the business side. We haven't even started talking about the human side, right? Like how their employees are dealing with having to work, crazy hours and like the pressures they're under and things like that. I think there have been pretty severe consequences. It's just that through a combination of luck, superhuman effort, cutting back on things that I think a lot of us would feel are quite important in a social media platform. They've managed to keep the core bit of the feed up and online almost all the time, including during some pretty high
Traffic events.
Huh?
High traffic events.
High traffic events, yeah. They've really managed to do it. And so, I credit the individuals who are still working there who are having to, deal with that working environment. I wouldn't say that they've managed to do it without significant consequences.
I don't think it tells us a lot either way, is my stance. I think kind of like they say about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell in some way. But I do think that it maybe tells us this, that actually if you design something well and you set up something well and it's as simple as Twitter is, which is not to say it's very simple. I could do it in a weekend, right? But there's a lot about it which is not touched by questions of regulation or data management or whatever, or actually should probably be more touched by questions of data management regulation than it is. But if you have something that is already kind of working, it's just much easier for inertia to keep that going. And I don't think its lack of collapse or otherwise tells us much about what's going on.
So I just want to throw something over to Andrew and hopefully answering Niall's one as well. If you're trying to hit that balance between, do we strive to be as proactive and have as much reliability as possible, even when people are going, no, you're going too far, we don't need that, we don't need to spend money on that. And then also, fine, I'm going to set it on fire, you'll be sorry. I think a possible path down the middle for that, and that we have seen steer Twitter, is regulation and compliance. Because they didn't change how things were run in Brazil out of the goodness of their hearts. They were forced to. And that's sort of the forcing function that maybe is what we can cling to help us walk that middle path. So interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so I've also been on the other side of the fence, been in a regulated entity in the financial services industry. And the approach that the Prudential Regulation Authority in the UK takes is to say to banks, define what your critical services are and for how long each of them can be offline before causing serious harm to customers, to the financial markets, or to you, the bank. So they don't say no outages. They say, what are the critical things, like, for example, money able to move in and out of the bank account? If you have a 3-second outage and transactions are queued, it doesn't really matter. If you have a 3-hour outage, people notice, but it's not the end of the world. If you have a 3-week outage, people don't get paid, they don't pay their rent, they can't buy groceries. So they ask the banks to define for themselves what is that period of time, and then ask the banks, how are you going to prevent an outage of that length? Which is, I think, an interesting approach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like, sometimes when you say to an industry, oh, you should regulate yourself and you should come up with those limits yourself, it's not always a message for, and you know, a plan for success, but when it's also something that's going to hurt them if they get it wrong, you know, maybe it will work. I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes financial penalties aren't enough. The thing that comes to mind for me is the roller coaster crash a few years ago in the UK at Thorpe Park. So essentially that was a block signalling system where the engineers told the system that a section of track was vacant when it was not vacant. And so two carriages collided and a lot of people were very seriously injured, and two of them had to have their legs amputated. So very, very serious. And the company was fined £5 million by the Health and Safety Executive. And they made a profit that year of 300 million. So 5 million doesn't affect them very much, I think.
I'm curious if, for each of you, if a regulator came to you today and went, we're thinking about regulating reliability in software companies. That was sort of, they just sent you an email, right? What would your suggestions be? Would you say, don't worry about it? Or what would you tell them?
I like, let's go, right? Like, no, I mean, like, for people who've been around, 10, 15 years, I remember having these conversations that long ago where we said, look, we're not regulated right now, but we will be, right? It's going to happen to all of us. We won't be treated as software companies as a whole, but they'll come after individual market segments and things like that. So for example, my company, we're in the telecom space. We deal with a lot of PII, we deal with a lot of personal health information, things like that, that goes over our networks. We're pretty heavily regulated already. And I'm going to use our example because I think it's actually a good one, where the company decided very early on, let's just go all in on this, right? Like we will take the, let's take the example of GDPR, right? Like GDPR is a pretty strict, pretty intensive thing for a company to have to apply. If you have to deal with GDPR, and I'm guessing a lot of people already do, who are here, why would you only apply that to your European customers? Just apply it to everybody, right? Just go all in on that and just apply it to everybody. And do that with all of the regulations. Go to the lowest common denominator, right? But the thing that can be applied most broadly, just do that everywhere. I think it's the right thing to do. It comes at a cost, it's difficult, it's a real pain, but it is the right thing to do. We should be held more accountable than we are. Our outages have impacts on people's lives.
Is there a possible race to the bottom there in terms of the other companies that save those costs then are more competitive?
Maybe.
Curious, Niall, Joan?
I say, if they called up and said, hey, we're thinking of regulating reliability, I would on the one hand, I'd be like, yes, let's go. On the other hand, I would I want to see your numbers. What are you using to determine this? Because if somebody comes up with some
let's have an
bullshit
engagement
thing,
about it.
Yeah, there has to be engagement. Because if it's just some sort of, everyone will have 5 nines, you're like, no, it's...
Sitting here today, I know it's impossible to say, but would you be like SLOs, regulated based on SLOs? Or is there something else you would say
Well, I don't know. I think it comes back to Andrew's point of, what are the critical points? I know somebody, I think they were working at Slack, and it's it started as this is a chat program effectively, and then they found out that I think they said, oh, we're going to have some maintenance, and then a customer reached out and said, we use this for ambulance dispatch, and they were like, oh, we did not know, So again, the regulations and it should match the function and match what's your critical function. So it should be appropriate. There should be engagement, because what I have found is as a company that's gone from chaos to public company, and the better you get at your job, the less people know what you're doing. And compliance efforts have been the best big stick we've had to move things sometimes. So.
Can I ask a question to the audience? How many people here use single sign-on that's provided by Google or Apple or something like that? Oh, come on! I know it's everybody. This was a setup question. But no, not Okta. Okta you pay for, right?
Okay.
Okta is a product you have to buy. But like these other companies, Facebook, Google, Apple, and LinkedIn, they provide this as a functionality. You click on a website, log in with, and then like there's your provider of choice. What guarantees do you have that that account of yours at that provider is protected in any way? Google could turn around and like disable your account. Facebook could do that. Any of these people could do that. And your login to many other parts of your lives is associated and gated through that thing. There's no regulation around this. There's no protection for people. And there should be. Like that should exist, because that is now, it's not ambulance level, ambulance dispatch level, but it is a critical part of your life. And these are the kinds of places where I think we should, yes, have more regulation.
So I would draw a line between that kind of thing, which strikes me as policy rather than reliability as such. I mean, it's an important question.
Sure, yeah.
And I've often thought about what fraction of my life would go away if Ellam at Gmail was in trouble, and the answer is quite a large fraction.
Yeah.
So I've got to fix that. But the thing I would say is I'm aware of how difficult regulation is to, first of all, make happen, and second of all, to change once it's happened. And so I wouldn't like specifications of implementation to be hard-coded in the regulation. I would prefer outcomes or mechanisms, right? I'm not even sure that, God help me, I'm not even sure SLOs are the right way to specify this.
The regulators don't like to be too specific. They like to do principles-based regulation, which means they don't get too specific about, it's got to be SLOs or it's got to be 5.9s or whatever. And part of the reason for that is if they say, here are the 5 things you must do, and then it turns out there was a 6th thing you should have done, then they can't really kind of come down hard on you for that. Yeah. So this is why they mostly say to the regulated entities, you need to work out for yourselves what the risks are and what you're going to do to mitigate them.
So, okay, currently we don't have, I would say, explicit regulation. So barring that, how do each of you make the case for continuous investment into reliability? I think one of the reasons I was really excited to get this group together is I'm pretty sure all of you have been making this sort of like advocating for this work, right, internally, and it's been super easy, right? Just you go, we should have some more reliability, and it's like, yes, how much money, right? Yeah. Okay. Who wants to take it first?
I tend to, wherever possible, I do not use the word technical debt, because again, like that's because you say technical debt, it's like you're saying climate change. Everyone gets depressed and stops listening. So I kind of go, we have outgrown this, and we need to modernize this to match our product growth, or, as in sort of, I tie the horrible past to what we need to do now. And sometimes I'm not even saying reliability, I'm just saying it just won't work and we can't grow. And I know this is all like Jedi mind tricks and emotional manipulation, but that's what I try to do. I'd have to just try and put it in terms of the business case. Because if I can't point to a fire, which was my old go-to, and it was really effective, setting things on fire was so effective. But then I just have to go and align it with the product needs and how to get there faster and product velocity. That's one of the strategies I've been using.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was a conversation this morning around cost in the discussion track. And I raised a point there that companies often, yes, companies love to save money. Every company loves to save money. It improves bottom line. Yes, we take that as granted. But companies also don't mind spending money as long as you can justify the value of like what you're getting out of it. Where companies get upset is that money is being spent, but the value isn't being derived from that. So it's really important for us to learn the languages of business and be able to describe, here's the money we spent, here's what we got for it, as well as we can in the realm of reliability. And when we're talking about reliability, what we can say is, And it is a little like hand wavy because like, did we prevent an incident? I don't know. I think we did. But you can look at previous incidents and say, look, there was an outage. It lasted this many hours. This was the impact to the business in terms of lost sales, in terms of SLA violations with our customers and blah. You make you draw that out. You say that's how much it cost. We could prevent more of these or reduce the occurrence of these by this amount if we invest this much money, right? That's the trade-off you make. And that's like when you're talking about black swan events and people making these trade-offs. That's what people will do in business, right? And that's how you do it. You do the best you can. Incidents will happen. You do your best to resolve them. But the follow-up from that is, here's what it takes. Here's the trade-off. And then the business has to decide, is it worth doing it?
The argument I've often made to product managers, because the problem is that non-functional requirements are not typically articulated by users. So the argument I've often made to product managers is if you ask airline passengers what they want, they'll say we want better movies, we want nicer food. They'll never say we don't want the wings to fall off because they take it as a given. And I think equally the Gmail customers probably take continuous availability of Gmail as a given. So sometimes selling into enterprises actually makes this easier because enterprise customers say your information security must meet these standards. You must give us an SLA of 5 nines availability, otherwise we won't sign the contract. And then the argument internally is we need to do this resilience work, otherwise we're going to miss our SLA.
Yeah, again, lots to respond to there. I think the first thing I'd say is that in an industry full of relentless quantification, it is surprisingly hard to make a numbers-based argument for continuous investment in reliability. Yeah. And I want to sharply distinguish between one-off, possibly even a long run of one-offs stuck together versus continuous investment. And again, possibly slightly weirdly, the one-off stuff, like there's a whole bunch of organizational hacks or cognitive hacks or whatever that you can do to motivate a particular intervention. Recency bias, I just heard about recency bias. It's the best thing ever. You can, never let a good crisis go to waste and so on. But continuous involves somehow in the mental space of engineering leadership, a commitment which is of a different category than the linear sum of a bunch of one-off interventions. And so in some sense, the fact that an SRE team exists would be a commitment to that, would be a successful demonstration of continuous, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, my favorite piece of research, which I go on and on about, is this Microsoft research about how accurate we are in the product world at figuring out whether or not the thing we've put on the backlog is actually going to derive the value that we expect to. And it turns out, long story short, that about 1/3 of things that you put in the backlog are positive, have the results that they should have, give you money, et cetera, et cetera. About 1/3 of them are net neutral, and about 1/3 of them are negative, meaning it costs money to run it, or it sits in the code base consuming programmer reading time and so on. And sometimes you can go and do a deal with product and you can say, on average, 1/3 of your stuff is going to be wrong, and 2/3,
help them work out which third it is.
Well, that's a bit trickier, but you could go, randomly speaking, we could replace
So using negging.
one of these things with the reliability improvement on an ongoing basis, and that will be net positive. So, if we put ourselves into the position of product or product development teams, or we are quite experienced with putting ourselves into the position of the user. And in theory, we are strong advocates for the user and the organization. But somehow the user's voice is getting more diluted these days, I think. Anyway.
Yeah. All right, we're actually, okay, we have time for 2 more. Okay. Joan, we had a conversation earlier today, and you mentioned something really interesting that I also want to ask the group. You mentioned that sort of in some of your conversations with stakeholders, you've been unearthing, discovering hidden constraints And as those constraints have been coming to light, they've changed your way of thinking about advocating for reliability.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd be curious to hear more about this, and then I also want to ask everyone else about hidden constraints that they discovered sort of through their time.
Yeah, I think it was just things like, as an engineer, you might be trying to push a change through, and somebody either within the engineering organ quite high up is saying no, or you can't seem to convince them of how important it is, or they're outside of the engineering org, and it's really hard to convince them. And you're like, are they stupid? Are they blind? What is it? And then you have more conversations with them. And I know this sounds like a really dumb thing of just have empathy for your coworkers, but half the time you don't know their restrictions. Like you talk to the CEO and you kind of think he's the CEO, he can do whatever he wants. And then you just see more of the pressure points on them, or you kind of, they're not allowed to care. They must care as hard as they can about the area that they are officially responsible for. They can maybe spare a little bit for your area, but unless you are very convincing and can tie to what they are currently legally bound to sort out, they cannot help you. And then if you're kind of thinking, oh, if only they took the time, the more I talk to like very, very senior engineering leadership, there is no time. Look at their calendars. Look at any person who's a VP's calendar, and you'll be like, no, thank you, don't want to do that. And it's just, I think the closer you get, the more you see how many constraints they're under. Like, it is still possible to get a change, but you have to make what you want align with the many challenges they're under. That's what I've been finding now.
I think culture is very important as well, and I think that's something that senior leadership can set, or at least that they ought to be setting. So I've worked for 2 really big tech companies, and in one of them, if there was any sort of outage or service degradation, there would be hundreds of people on the call. The VP would be on the call. It would be, oh my God. And in the other one, it would be kind of, oh, well, someone's working on it, it'll be fine. And it's a difference of culture and following the money as well. If everyone knows that it's costing however many $1 million a minute of outage, somehow that has more of an effect.
Oh, yeah.
Avleen, Niall? Interesting, weird constraints?
I think the thing I'd say is that hidden constraints are not hidden from the point of view of the constraint. Right? So they...
Unpack that a little bit.
That's very metaphysical there.
So if you encounter a situation where a VPN is unable to authorize something because their calendar is blocked, the VPN knows that they are constrained.
Oh, yeah.
And what is the issue from their point of view is that they are receiving what are hopefully important, this needs to happen now, style messages, and they can't act on them. So I think the thing I would say is that the best approach to working around this is to make the time between the discovery of the constraint and the urgency of the thing you need to do as large as possible, which possibly argues, I have just now realized, for introducing false things early and so overwhelming the already overwhelmed VPs. Yeah, anyway, maybe...
So we've added lying.
Yeah, maybe not that one.
I would remind everyone that you are at your company to do one thing, and that is help the company do better, right? You're there to serve the needs of the business. You may think that reliability is the most important thing, and that's kind of our jobs. That's why we're here. The R stands for still, I think, reliability for now. But it may not be the most important thing for the business. It's up to you to make the case, and if you can, great. Like if you can get the time with the VP, yes, that is all wonderful. There will actually probably, like my experience is that there's more times when you can't make the case, right? And so try and find ways where you can align that work with what needs to be done for the business, right? You need to get a feature out, great. As part of getting this feature out, maybe we can also make this code base, this area of the code base a little bit more reliable, a little bit better. We need to put some work that's going to take 2 or 3 sprints. How can we add some improvements to that and just start slowly making these improvements and just build those into the cost of doing the work, right? There's little things like that you can do, but it's up to you. If you can advocate for it, do advocate for it. If you can't advocate for it, just you have to find some other ways to make it possible as well at the same time.
This is going by really fast. So, closing thoughts before we get yelled at. For each of you, any closing thoughts, and is reliability a luxury good?
I'm going to say it depends on who you're trying to sell it to. If you're selling it to somebody who's like, I don't want to say if you've done your job too well, it's more if you are too far and too abstracted from the people making the decision, yeah, they're going to be like, this is totally luxury. What are you doing? No. Like they might not even know that you're an SRE team. They might just know they're the people who run the platform. They might not actually realize that's part of it. So, whereas if you're talking to somebody who, they've got a much more visceral feeling for how often that team is at the sharp end and they've felt the sharp end themselves, it's an easier sell. So I'm going to say it depends on who you're selling it to. Yeah.
I'm going to say it depends on when you're selling it, right? I think you got the who, and I totally agree with that, right? Depending on the life cycle of a company, right, and where you're at in terms of the business. If your business is struggling because your systems are unreliable, reliability is not a luxury good. Like you have to improve it, and we've all been through this. But the problem is kind of what you're saying, what you said earlier, Joan, is when everything is going well, nobody really wants to invest in it, and it does become kind of a luxury. Like, do we need this? How do we do it? It would be wonderful if reliability was a luxury. Like investing because we really need to was a luxury good, right? If we were able to bake more of this into our systems, make them more reliable than they generally are, put a little bit more focus on it, that would be good, and it would reduce sort of ongoing burdens and so on. It'll never happen, but it would be nice if it did.
I think it is a race to the bottom, as we were talking about earlier. I think if you've got a bunch of competitors, then the one that invests less in reliability will, in the short term, be more commercially successful, and these decisions tend to be very short term. There are some companies which think long term in this respect, which focus on optimizing their KPIs over multiple decades, and they do very well, but they're in the minority. So I think, I think it depends on the industry you're in. I think in a lot of industries, it is just a race to the bottom. I think in other industries, when there's a crisis, you get regulation as a result of it. So if we're in the information revolution, sometimes it's interesting to look back at the Industrial Revolution and what happened then. They had the cholera plagues and the Great Stink, which was where the Thames was full of sewage. And so the UK introduced the Public Health Act. In the 50s, they had terrible smog, and so they introduced the Clean Air Act. We've had some banking outages, and so they're introducing banking regulation of resilience. We are having some major failures of content moderation, and so we're getting laws around content moderation. So I think it depends which industry you're in, and ultimately public opinion dictates to politicians who set regulatory policy for particular industry verticals to set a minimum standard, and that's where the race to the bottom stops.
Yeah. You asked the question now, and now you get to answer it.
I just wanted to work, Emil. Very, very seriously. I just wanted to work. I spend a lot of time thinking about business these days. I don't want reliability to become packaged up as a luxury good and moved up market. Mm. I don't want Gmail 5.9s to exist and be 10x price. Everything else.
2 versions of Gmail.
2 versions of Gmail.
10x of 0 is still 0.
Good mathematical.
Well, the big cloud service providers are going to have to choose, do they want a separate financial services cloud, which is regulated and probably 10 times the price, or do they want to accept regulation for their whole cloud? So, yeah.
Okay, on that note, thank you everyone for staying a few minutes over. Please give our panelists a round of applause.